Hi everyone. In this video I am going to show you how to train a GIS to read a LANDSAT image and turn it into a map of land cover classifications. So our goal in doing this is to take a multiband raster, here shown in a false color composite of an area, viewed 3 bands of a 7-band raster here, and take all 7 bands of information in the raster, not just the 3 that we can see, and use all of that information to identify different types of land cover in the area of interest. So here we've taken this raster and we've mapped out where asphalt is, parks are, fallow land, residential areas, commercial and industrial. And there's a couple of ways that we can do this. Before we start though, I want to just remind you of what type of data that we're dealing with. For this demonstration, we're going to use LANDSAT 8 imagery. And the LANDSAT 8 satellite has 11 different sensors on it, each of which produces its own image, and each of which produces an image at slightly the same or different resolutions. And each of them produces an image that is tuned to a specific range of wavelengths of light. So, for example, band 2 in a LANDSAT 8 image corresponds to visible blue, band 3 to visible green, and band 4 to visible red. All of the rest of the bands are infrared bands, except for this panchromatic band, which is towards the red end of the visible spectrum. All of these images for each of these different wavelengths of light are recorded with 12-bit radiometric resolution. What that means is that the sensor can sense 2 to the 12th power levels of brightness, and that's about 4,000 different levels of brightness. So a very precise instrument. It turns out that when sunlight strikes the Earth's surface, objects on that surface either absorb or reflect some of the wavelengths of light that come in contact with it. And that produces what's called a spectral response for the surface. Here below is a spectral response curve for grass, and superimposed on this chart, this is basically wavelengths of light on the x-axis versus the brightness of the response recorded by the sensor for different wavelengths of light that are picked up by the LANDSAT imagery in band 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So this curve right here is showing you what grass does, what grass reflects, and what it doesn't. Grass is green because it reflects more light in the green part of the spectrum than in the blue or in the red. And that's all we can see with respect to grass. However, in the infrared bands, grass is actually much, much, much brighter than the green, and that's why when you superimpose infrared in place of red in a LANDSAT image, grass will actually appear to be red because it's got a lot more of this band in it than this band. And virtually every surface on Earth has an identifiable spectral response that we can use to map out different substances if we know what the spectral response is. So, for example, here is a red-orange sandy soil, which peaks out here in some of the infrared bands, but is pretty dim in terms of visible light, and those are the visible light bands right there. Here's a curve for limestone, which is brighter than soil in the visible spectrum, but still not as bright in the infrared as soil is. And then here is a curve for basalt, a dark colored rock, which is pretty dim in the visible light bands and pretty dim in just about everything else because it absorbs more light than it emits. And then finally at the bottom is a spectral response curve for tap water, and water is pretty absorptive. It doesn't reflect a lot of light unless the light hits it at just the right angle to reflect the visible light back. Okay, so we're going to take a LANDSAT image with 7 bands on it, and we're going to use that information to classify an image in terms of land surface types. And there's two ways to do this. The first is unsupervised classification, which is basically an automated process. It automatically detects and maps statistically different clusters of pixels on an image, and I'll talk a little bit about how that works next. The second way is supervised classification. In supervised classification, you train the GIS to recognize different things by telling the GIS where there is one surface versus another on the image, and then the GIS goes through and maps those user-defined populations across the entire image. And we'll talk about that after we talk about unsupervised classification. Okay, so unsupervised classification is a process by which the GIS will take all the pairs of bands that are possible in the image. Here's one of those pairs, red, visible red versus near infrared, and then plots every single pixel of the image onto that graph of one band versus another. And for every band, it picks a user-specified number of values, just randomly, that fall somewhere within the total range of values. So here I've picked 3 random values for red and random values of near infrared, and I've plotted those 3 values here on this chart. Well, once I have those 3 random values, then all I need to do is to pick out all the pixels that are closest to class 2, that would be these, and call those class 2 pixels. All the ones closest to class 1 are class 1 pixels, all the ones closest to class 3 are class 3 pixels. So now I've got a classification scheme based on these 3 random values. But we're not going to stop there. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take those 3 random values and we're going to make them non-random by reassigning the locations of these values to the average values for all the pixels that we've already selected. So in other words, we're going to move class 2 to the average value for all these class 2 pixels. Class 1 to the average value of all the class 1 pixels, class 3 to the average value of all the class 3 pixels. And when we do that, what we then have is we have a very different arrangement of pixels around these 3 averages, and we can redefine our classes based on the new locations of these 3 averages. So now we've got a class 2 that consists of all these pixels, class 1 consists of all these, and class 3 consists of all those. And then we'll repeat the process. We'll take the average of each of these selected classes of pixels and we'll move these points to those averages. And then we'll reclassify the image again. Reset those class boundaries. And we'll repeat this over and over and over again until there's no more change in the values or the boundaries between different classes of pixels. And what this tends to do is it tends to pick out the natural clusters that occur in the data. As you can see, there's a natural cluster here, a natural cluster here, and a natural cluster here. If I used 4 different classes, I might get a completely different arrangement. If I used fewer, I might get a different arrangement still. But with 3 classes, it doesn't matter where the original location of those values were. They will always be pushed into this arrangement simply by repeating that process. And that process takes place not only between 2 bands, here the red and near infrared, but between all 7 bands and between all combinations of those 7 bands. Simply extending this 2-dimensional process into an n-dimensional process, with n being the number of bands. Okay, so this is what an unsupervised map looks like. On the right is a true color image of the Greencastle area, and on the left is an unsupervised classification of a Landsat image for that same area. And you can see it did a pretty good job of picking out where different things are, but it didn't really do a great job of dividing up classes of things that are useful to us. For example, the black curvilinear feature here is Big Walnut Creek, and that's a stream. This long linear feature here is a railroad, and it basically mapped railroad and stream as the same thing. And what this is telling us is that railroads and streams both have a very, very similar spectral response. And so if we want to differentiate those on doing a supervised classification, we better be pretty careful about picking the pixels here and here to make sure that these actually do fall into different classes. It's also mapped, both of those two things is the same as water. That's the quarry pond. And so we're going to probably want to be pretty careful about mapping out and making sure that we define separate classes for pond versus railroad. On the other hand, it did a pretty good job of picking out forest here, shown in yellow, but there are a few lone pixels through here inside the forested area that are picked out as something else. And that's simply because there are shadows in the tree canopy here, and those shadows, because they're dark, are coming out the same class as the pond, railroad, and stream. Okay, unsupervised classifications like this are seldom used for any other purpose except just to explore the data, just to see what natural clusters there are and to give you an idea of what's going to be harder to define as separate things versus easier to define as separate things. And here this is telling you that the forest is going to be pretty easily separable from fields, and that the quarry and the urban area here are going to be pretty hard to differentiate. But we'll just have to be careful about that. Okay, supervised classification is a little bit different. In a supervised classification, the user actually trains the GIS to recognize specific class types. For example, these two gold areas on the map are just polygons that I've drawn to tell the GIS that this and this are examples of cornfields. Once the GIS knows that these two things are cornfields, it can then build a model of what a cornfield looks like by characterizing the pixels in these areas statistically for every band. And one way to see that and visualize that pretty clearly is through histograms. So these are histograms of 4 bands, band 1, 2, 3, and 4, in the raster image. And it shows you where those pixels lie in terms of brightness in each band. And you can see that a cornfield is pretty dim in all of these and pretty narrow in most of them. It's a very narrow distribution here, here, and here, but it widens here in band 4. And that's going to be important for how we characterize the population. Our cornfield model can then be visualized as a set of scatter plots between bands in 7 dimensions or however many dimensions we have bands. And this is sort of similar to what we did before. We just plot band 1 against band 2, band 1 against band 3, band 1 against band 4 and 5, etc. And do that for all possible pairs of bands. And once we've got scatter plots of all possible pairs of bands, if there's 7 bands, there's going to be 49 plots. 7 times 7. Then for each of those plots, we can define an average value for a cornfield. And we can also define what's called the covariance surrounding that value, which is a way to characterize the spread of values around that average. So here's just schematically what that might look like. There's the average value for a cornfield with respect to the brightness in band 1 and the brightness in band 2, and the covariance of that distribution, showing that there's more spread in this direction than in this direction. Same thing here, a little bit wider spread in this direction, a little bit less spread in the other direction. Okay, well, once we've defined means and covariances for every possible pair of bands for a cornfield, and then once we've defined not only cornfields, but forest and pond and building, etc. Once we've defined a number of classes, we can use the maximum likelihood technique to assign classes to all pixels on the image. So we've taught it what a cornfield looks like, and it can now identify cornfields in other areas of the image based on the model that it creates from the two that we've defined. So just sort of schematically what that might look like is, let's say we have three classes on the image, A, B, and C, and those are the average values for each of those three classes. And the actual pixels for A spread out over a wider area about that mean than they do for B or C. What that means is that if we have a point right here where the blue star is, and that point right there lies outside the covariance for all three of these, but it's closer to A because it lies fewer covariances away from the mean. Same thing here with C. If that point were pushed over until it was right up against C, then it would probably belong to class C. If it were pushed over into the covariance realm of point B, then it would end up classifying as point B. Now, the actual ellipses that we're using around these means are not in 2 dimensions as shown here. They're in 7 dimensions because it's using all 7 bands of the image. We can't actually represent that because we're not able to perceive 7 dimensions, but the mathematics behind it are exactly the same. And the concept is exactly the same. Okay, so here's what an unsupervised classification versus a supervised classification looks like. And in the unsupervised, I've defined five classes. In the supervised, I've only defined 3. And picked out that quarry pond pretty well. Actually, I guess I defined 4 classes. The quarry pond was one of them. Picked out that quarry pond and differentiated it from railroads and streams and all the rest of that. It picked out forests a lot better in yellow here. And it picked out fields quite a bit better as well. What it didn't do a good job of quite yet is pick out the difference between a quarry and a building, for example. So doing supervised classification is really sort of an exercise in looking at what you think the GIS is going to have trouble differentiating and being more careful with those classes. And then looking at things that you think the GIS is going to easily be able to classify, and you don't need quite as much data for those. Okay, in our next video here, after a little bit of a pause, I will actually show you how to implement both of these in a GIS. Okay, so here we have an image of Greencastle, Indiana, and the regions surrounding it. And this is a LANDSAT image with 7 bands, and I'm just showing a true color version of that with band 4 in the red channel, band 3 in the green channel, and band 2 in the blue channel, so you can see a true color image. In order to classify this using ArcGIS, what I will do is I will open up the image classification toolbar, and the first thing I'm going to run is unsupervised classification. And unsupervised classification is accessible via this drop-down menu. It's called ISO cluster unsupervised classification. That's basically a GIS term for the method that I explained to you earlier. And if I open up this tool, it gives me several options. First of all, inputting the raster bands. There's only one image in there, so I'll put it in there for me. Second thing I need to supply it with is the number of classes that I want to define. So let's do 6. Just random guess there. We'll do 6 classes. And then we'll output our classified raster into some place. And I'm on my home computer here, so this is not the sort of directory structure you guys would see. I'm going to save it in the default geodatabase because I don't want to keep it. I'm gonna get rid of it once I'm done with this lecture. We can define the minimum class size. Now this parameter here basically allows you to control how many pixels that are contiguous can actually make up an independent class. The larger this number is, the less random little small classes you're going to have scattered throughout the image. So I'm going to leave this at 20 because we're looking at a fairly small area, and I think 20 is a good size. Okay, I'm going to click OK on this. And after a minute or so that I've edited out of the video, we end up with this answer. So this is the natural clustering of pixels in our image with 6 classes defined, and you can see it's picking out some things like quarries pretty well, but it's still matching them to buildings. It's picking out fields pretty well. It's still putting a bunch of random stuff in the forest, so we'll have to pay attention to that. And it's still classified the railroad just like the stream. Okay, so that's how you do unsupervised classification. I'm going to go ahead and remove this from the map. Now what we're going to do is we're going to play around with doing supervised classification. And the way that you do that is you open up this training sample manager, and this is going to show you all of your classes and link those classes to polygons that you draw on the map. So I'll use this tool here to draw a couple of polygons on the map. Let's say one right here, which would be my cornfield class. Maybe one down here, which is a cornfield that looks a little bit different, at least in terms of green and yellow. Maybe another one down here, which, even though it's brown, is probably still a cornfield. And maybe this one here too. Okay, so I've got 4 different polygons, all of which are different versions of the same thing, different versions of a field or a cornfield. And what I can do is I can select all of those and then merge those together into a single class that I'll call field. Okay, the next thing that we can do is maybe zoom in on the image here and pick out some of the pixels that I know to represent quarries. So there's a quarry there, another one down here. I'll merge those 2 together, call that quarry. And there are plenty of forested areas around, and you can see that the character of the pixels throughout these forested areas changes from place to place because of shadows in the tree canopy. And I will make sure that I'm defining both the tree canopy itself and the shadowed areas when I go through and define areas that correspond to forest. We'll get some of the nature bark in here. Let's see, maybe another patch of forest here. Okay, I'll merge those together into the class forest. And let's see. One of the trickiest things to get is going to be where the character of pixels changes a lot, and that's true of most urban areas, especially residential areas with lots of trees. So this portion of Greencastle here, where there's lots of trees mixed in with roads and buildings, I'm going to classify this area as residential. And this area here, where there's not a lot of trees, I will classify as urban. And that's typically how it's done. Let's see, what else? Okay, we got the Quarry Pond here. So we've got to classify those pixels. And there's another one down in this quarry. And a couple more over here. that are greener, but still ponds. So we'll have to make sure that our population of samples includes those that are greener as well. And we'll make sure all of these classify as a lake. Okay, so I've got 6 classes that I've defined here, 6 populations, and those populations can be saved. Well, we can look at them first. So if we want to know what a field looks like, we can visualize it in terms of histograms. Good narrow distributions in the visible bands, band 1, 2, 3, and 4, a little bit more spread in terms of red. Once we get up into the higher order bands, the spread is a lot broader. But that's what a field looks like. Quarries, much larger spread and much brighter. Residential, much larger spread and everything. And lakes should be nice and narrow. Yep, narrow all the way through. We can also look at this in terms of scatter plots. So we can view scatter plots between all pairs of values in the image, or all pairs of bands. So there's between band 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 3 and 6, 3 and 5, etc. 6 and 7 seem to be pretty well correlated. Okay, so we can explore the data that way. And once we're satisfied with our 6 classes, we can save what's called a signature file. And I'm just going to save this to my desktop. You won't see this. You would, if you were doing this, you'd want to save it to your iDrive. And I will save it, and I'll replace one that I made earlier. Once I've got my signature file, again, the signature file is just going to contain the information that is needed to characterize these populations. So it's going to consist of a list of means for every classification, and it's going to consist of a list of covariances for all of those as well. Okay, so once I've got that signature file, I can perform supervised classification. And the one that I like to use is maximum likelihood. That's the one that we discussed earlier. So if I open up this tool, and I input all of my raster bands, which I already have inputted there, and I upload that signature file, which contains all of my classes and their means and covariances, then I can output a classified raster wherever I want. And I'm going to save this to my default geodatabase again because I don't want to keep it, but you would want to save this to your iDrive folder because this is your final map. And I'm going to say that we're going to reject none of the cells, which means every cell will be classified regardless of whether it really fits well into a category or not. The probability weighting is going to be equal. All classes have the same initial probability, and we can fiddle with that parameter as well. And if I click OK on this, then after a minute or two that I've edited out of the video, we get this result. And I changed all the names here to reflect, and the colors that were by default to reflect the categories that we had defined and to give them different colors. So it's pretty easy to see here what's a field and what's a forest, and I think I did a pretty good job of picking out the forests. You can see that the residential classification picked out not only residential neighborhoods in Greencastle, but also residential areas outside of Greencastle, and I think it actually picked a little bit too much. We'll have to maybe tune that a little bit better when we do this again. Picked out quarries pretty well, but also classified some of the quarries as urban areas. So clearly it's difficult to distinguish between quarries, bare rock, and urban areas. We'll have to be a little bit more careful about how we do that. But this is the basic technique, and the more you refine the placement of your sampling and the better you are at picking areas to sample, the better this map will become. Thanks for listening.